The first lie I told my husband in 32 years tasted of salt and whiskey. It was the taste of the ocean air on another man's lips, a flavor I hadn't known I was starving for, until it bloomed on my tongue, hot and profound. It wasn't a planned betrayal. It was a shattering, a quiet, tectonic shift that cracked the foundations of a life I had so carefully, so dutifully constructed. Before that moment, I was Eleanor Vance, a woman of 58, whose life had calcified into a series of predictable, comfortable patterns. I was a wife, a mother to children long since flown, a keeper of a quiet house on a quiet suburban street. I thought the years for seismic change were far behind me, buried under decades of PTA meetings, grocery lists, and the gentle, monotonous rhythm of a stable marriage. I was wrong. The tremor that would eventually bring my world down didn't begin with a kiss, but with an invitation, one so strange and out of place it felt like a misdirected piece of mail from a universe I didn't inhabit. My husband David had worked under Julian Croft for 15 years. Julian was the enigmatic founder of a prestigious architectural firm, a man who seemed more like a phantom than a boss. We'd see him at the annual holiday party, a tall, silver-haired figure who moved through the crowd with an unnerving stillness, his eyes a pale, watchful gray. He spoke in low, measured tones, and his presence had a gravitational pull that silenced idle chatter. He was polite, remote, and utterly unreadable. He and I had exchanged perhaps 100 words in a decade and a half, all of them pleasantries as thin as tracing paper. So when David came home on a Tuesday in late autumn, the air already crisp with the promise of frost, and announced Julian's invitation, I thought I'd misheard him. "He what?" I asked, pausing with a casserole dish halfway into the oven. David loosened his tie, his movements weary, predictable. "Julian, he invited you to his place on the coast for the weekend." I straightened up, my mind struggling to connect the pieces. The words didn't fit. "Me? He invited me?" "Us, I mean," David corrected himself quickly, though his eyes didn't meet mine. "But I can't go. We have that massive pitch on Monday, and I'll be chained to the desk all weekend. He insisted you go anyway, said the ocean air would do you good." I stared at him, the heat from the oven warming my face. It made no sense. Julian Croft did not issue casual invitations. He was a man of intention, of precise angles and calculated designs. A weekend at his famously isolated home, a place spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by the firm's employees, was not a casual gesture. "Why would he invite me, David? He barely knows I exist." David shrugged, running a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture that signaled his desire to end the conversation. "I don't know, Elle. He was insistent. Said you looked tired at the fundraiser last month. Maybe he's just trying to be nice." Tired. The word landed like a small, sharp stone. I was tired. I was bone-weary, but it was a fatigue so deep it had become a part of my personality. It was the exhaustion of 1,000 identical days, of knowing what the person lying next to you would say before he said it, of feeling your own soul slowly fading into the floral wallpaper of the dining room. But Julian Croft was not the kind of man to notice such a thing, or if he did, he was not the kind of man to mention it. A strange current, a flicker of something long dormant, moved through me. It was a dangerous cocktail of suspicion and, to my shame, flattery. To be seen, even in my weariness, was an unsettling novelty. "I don't think I should," I said, the words automatic, the protest of a woman who hadn't made an independent decision in years. "Don't be silly," David said, already reaching for the mail on the counter. "It's a beautiful house. Go, relax. It's just a weekend." He didn't see the strangeness of it, or chose not to. To him, it was a social obligation, a box to be ticked. To me, it felt like a summons. I hadn't spent a weekend alone, truly alone. since before my daughter was born. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. And so, with a sense of stepping off a ledge in the dark, I agreed. I would go. I would spend a weekend in the house of a man I barely knew, a man who had looked at me and seen something I thought was invisible to the world. The drive north on Friday was a slow-motion shedding of my own life. For the first hour, the highway was a familiar ribbon of concrete, flanked by shopping centers and exit signs for towns I knew. My thoughts were a tangled mess of domestic worries. Did I remember to cancel the newspaper? Was there enough dog food for the weekend? Then, as I turned onto the coastal route, the world transformed. The manicured suburbs gave way to salt marshes, skeletal trees, and a vast, moody sky the color of slate. The air that came through the open window grew sharp and briny. With every mile, the sense of Eleanor Vance, wife and homemaker, began to unravel. I was just a woman in a car, heading toward an unknown destination, a strange new sense of anonymity washing over me. His directions were precise, leading me off the main road onto a winding, unpaved lane shrouded by gnarled pines. The lane ended abruptly at a cliff's edge, and there was the house. It wasn't a house. It was a statement. A structure of glass, dark steel, and weathered cedar, it clung to the granite cliffs like a hawk surveying its territory. It didn't blend with the landscape. It challenged it. The entire western wall was a sheet of glass that stared out at the churning, white-capped Atlantic. It was magnificent, austere, and terrifyingly isolated. Julian was waiting for me outside, standing by a low stone wall, the wind whipping his silver hair. He wasn't dressed like a boss, but in dark jeans and a thick charcoal-gray cashmere sweater, sleeves pushed up his forearms. He looked less like an architect and more like a poet or a sea captain. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low baritone that was nearly lost in the roar of the surf below. "I was beginning to worry you'd changed your mind." "The directions were very clear," I said, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to my own ears. I stepped out of the car, instantly feeling underdressed and out of place, a suburban sparrow in an eagle's nest. And he took my overnight bag from my hand before I could protest, his grip firm and warm. "I'm glad you came. The city can feel suffocating this time of year." He led me inside, and I felt as if I were stepping into a magazine. The interior was minimalist and vast. Polished concrete floors, a soaring ceiling, and almost no furniture except for a few low-slung leather couches, a massive stone fireplace, and shelves filled not with books, but with strange, beautiful objects, bleached driftwood, sea-worn glass, and smooth, dark stones. But the true centerpiece was the window. The ocean wasn't just a view. It was a living, breathing entity that filled the entire space with its wild, gray light and thunderous sound. "It's breathtaking," I managed to say. "It's honest," he replied, setting my bag down. "The sea doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, powerful, indifferent, and occasionally beautiful." He turned to face me, his pale eyes searching my face. "I promised you a relaxing weekend. No schedules, no expectations, just air, water, and quiet, and whiskey, if you're so inclined." That first evening set a strange, hypnotic rhythm. We didn't make small talk. The roar of the ocean seemed to swallow trivialities. He poured us both a measure of amber whiskey in heavy crystal glasses, and we sat on one of the leather couches, watching the sky bleed from gray to a deep, bruised purple. He asked me about my garden, not in a polite, perfunctory way, but with genuine curiosity about the science of it, the soil composition, the battle against blight. I found myself talking for 20 minutes about heirloom tomatoes and the existential rage of battling Japanese beetles. He listened, truly listened, his head tilted, his gaze never leaving my face. It was unnerving. I wasn't used to being the subject of such focused attention. With David, our conversations had become a form of shorthand, a comfortable exchange of information. This was different. This was exploration. Later he asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. What did you want to be, Eleanor, before you became what you are? I blinked, the whiskey warming my throat. The question was so direct, so intimate, it felt like a violation. But coming from him, in this house at the edge of the world, it felt like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. A cartographer, I said, the word tasting strange on my tongue. I hadn't said it aloud in 30 years. I wanted to map the world. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, in his eyes. A noble pursuit, to bring order to the chaos, to give people a way to find their place. He looked out at the churning sea. And did you? Did I what? Find your place? I looked down into my glass, at the swirling gold liquid. I suppose I did. A home, a family, a life. The words sounded hollow, a script I had memorized. That's a place, he said softly. But is it yours? We ate a simple dinner of grilled fish and roasted vegetables, prepared with an effortless competence that suggested he spent a great deal of time alone. The conversation drifted, but it never strayed into the mundane. We talked about art, about the impermanence of buildings, about the way light changed on the water. It was the kind of conversation I'd imagined having in college, full of big ideas and earnest wonder. I felt a part of my brain flicker to life, a part that had been dormant for decades. As the evening deepened, a log in the fireplace shifted, sending a shower of embers up the chimney. The sound startled me. Julian looked at me, a faint, sad smile on his lips. It's a lonely house, he said, not as an apology, but as a statement of fact. It demands a certain kind of companion. I didn't know how to respond. The air between us was charged with unspoken things. This wasn't a kindness from a benevolent boss. It was something else, something I couldn't yet name. When I went to the guest room he'd prepared for me, a monastic space with a simple bed and another massive window facing the sea, I lay awake for hours. The sound of the waves was a constant, thunderous heartbeat. It wasn't a peaceful sound. It was the sound of something immense and untamable. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a kinship with it. I felt awake. I woke the next morning to a world swathed in thick silver fog. The ocean's roar was muffled, the view from my window a uniform pearlescent gray. The house was silent. For a moment, a sliver of panic pierced through me. The isolation felt absolute, as if the rest of the world had vanished overnight. I found a note on the polished kitchen island, written in a sharp, architectural script on a heavy piece of cardstock. Went for a walk. There's coffee. Join me on the cliffs if you feel brave. Brave. The word echoed the feeling in my chest. I poured a mug of the strong black coffee and dressed in the warmest things I'd brought: jeans, a thick sweater, a wool coat. When I stepped outside, the cold, damp air was a shock. It smelled of salt and wet stone and pine. The fog was so dense, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. Following a narrow stone path that led away from the house, I felt my heart begin to pound, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was an adventure. When was the last time I'd had an adventure? I found him standing at the very edge of a precipice, a dark silhouette against the swirling gray. He was looking down at the invisible surf, crashing somewhere below. He turned as I approached, his face serene. "I was hoping you'd come," he said. "The world feels new on a morning like this, doesn't it? Like it's still being created." We stood there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in the primordial air. The fog swirled around us, clinging to our hair and clothes in tiny, cold droplets. It felt like we were the only two people left on Earth. "Are you a lonely man, Julian?" I asked, the question emerging from the fog as if it were a part of the atmosphere itself. He didn't seem surprised. He turned his gaze from the sea to me, and his pale eyes were full of a deep, ancient melancholy. "I have been," he admitted. "My wife. She died many years ago. She loved the city. She found this place oppressive. After she was gone, I found I couldn't live anywhere else. The noise of the world felt dishonest." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Are you a lonely woman, Eleanor?" The question was a perfectly aimed arrow. It bypassed all my defenses and struck the very center of my being. I thought of David, of our quiet, parallel lives, of the chasm of silence that had grown between us over the years, a space we had both tacitly agreed never to cross. "Yes," I whispered, the admission stolen by the wind. "I think I am." He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking understanding. We walked for over an hour along the cliff's edge, the path treacherous in the fog. He walked slightly ahead, occasionally turning to offer me a hand over a slippery patch of rock. His touch was impersonal, practical, yet every time his fingers brushed mine, a jolt of electricity shot through me. We talked about his late wife, and for the first time, I talked about my children. Not the successful adults they had become, but the small, wild creatures they had been, and the gaping hole their absence had left in the center of my life. Back at the house, cheeks flushed with cold, he lit a fire in the massive hearth. "I used to paint," he said, seemingly out of nowhere, as he watched the flames catch. "Watercolors. I was never very good, but it was a way of seeing, really seeing what was in front of me." He looked over at me. "Do you have anything like that? A way of seeing?" I thought of the cartography books I still kept in the attic, their pages brittle and yellowed. I thought of the feeling of a fine-tipped pen in my hand, the thrill of creating a world on paper. "I used to," I said. "It got lost somewhere along the way." "Things that are lost can be found," he said quietly. That afternoon he did something that moved me more than any grand gesture could have. He cleared the large wooden table near the window and laid out a roll of thick, creamy paper. From a wooden chest, he produced a set of antique watercolor paints, a porcelain palette, and a jar of sable brushes. "I don't expect you to map the coastline," he said with a small smile, "but maybe just play with the color. See what the fog looks like on paper." I hesitated, a wave of fear and inadequacy washing over me. It had been so long. My hands felt clumsy, alien, but he didn't push. He simply set a glass of water down for the brushes and went to another part of the house, leaving me alone with the blank paper. Hesitantly, I sat down. I dipped a brush in the water, then into a block of dark, inky blue. As I touched the brush to the paper, watching the color bleed and spread, something inside me broke open. A dam of unshed tears, of unspoken longing, of decades of muted grayscale living. I wasn't painting the fog. I was painting my own soul. I painted for hours, losing all track of time, my tears mixing with the water on the palette. That night, the tension between us had changed. It was no longer just a current of unspoken attraction. It was a deep, resonant chord of shared vulnerability. We ate dinner in comfortable silence, the fire crackling beside us, the storm outside seeming to echo the one inside me. After, he put on a record, a scratchy, melancholic jazz piece played on a lone piano. "May I?" he asked, standing and holding out his hand. It wasn't a question about dancing. It was a question about crossing a line. I looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes, and I knew that if I said no, I could return to my life, to my quiet house and my comfortable routines, and pretend this weekend had never happened. I could remain Eleanor Vance, but I didn't want to be her anymore. I placed my hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm. He drew me to my feet and into his arms, one hand resting on the small of my back. We swayed slowly to the music, not speaking. I rested my head against his chest, closing my eyes, and for the first time, I felt the full, crushing weight of my own loneliness and the incredible, terrifying relief of having someone else feel it with me. He smelled of wood smoke, wool, and the faint, clean scent of the sea. It was the smell of a life lived authentically, without apology. When the music ended, we didn't move. He tilted my chin up with his fingers, his touch impossibly gentle. His gray eyes searched mine, and in their depths I saw my own reflection, not a tired, invisible woman, but someone vital and awake. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And that's when he kissed me. It wasn't the tentative, gentle kiss I might have expected. It was a kiss of raw, desperate honesty. It was the taste of salt and whiskey, of loneliness and longing, of two people finding a harbor in a storm. In that moment, the careful map of my life was torn to shreds, and all that was left was the wild, uncharted territory of a new world. The third day dawned clear and cold. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky of brilliant crystalline blue and an ocean that glittered as if strewn with diamonds. The beauty was so sharp it hurt to look at. A new clarity had settled between us, as sharp and bright as the morning light. The kiss had changed everything. There was no awkwardness, only a quiet, profound intimacy. We moved around the kitchen making breakfast together, our bodies brushing past each other in a new, comfortable choreography. We ate at the table by the window, the silence filled not with tension, but with a sense of immense peace. I knew I had to leave. I knew there was a life, a husband, waiting for me. But the thought of returning to that life felt like trying to force myself into a dress that was now 2 sizes too small. "I don't know what to do," I said, the words falling into the quiet space between us. Julian reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His warmth seeped into my skin. "You don't have to do anything today," he said. "All you have to do is breathe, and remember what it feels like to be alive." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "This place. It will be here, Eleanor, and so will I." It wasn't a promise of an affair. It was an offer of sanctuary, a place to find myself, should I be brave enough to look. Packing my bag was an act of surreal deliberation. Each item, my modest sweater, my sensible shoes, felt like a relic from another person's life. When I was ready to leave, Julian walked me to my car. The wind was brisk, and it pulled strands of hair across my face. He tucked them gently behind my ear. He didn't kiss me goodbye. Instead, he pressed a small, rolled-up piece of paper into my hand. "Something to help you navigate," he said, his eyes holding mine. I didn't open it until I was a mile down the road. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the sound of the ocean already fading behind me. I unrolled the paper. It was a watercolor painting, the one I had made. The chaotic, beautiful mess of blues and grays and blacks. In the bottom corner in his sharp architectural hand, he had written a single word: North. The drive home was a blur. I saw the familiar landmarks, the manicured lawns, the safe, predictable streets of my neighborhood. But I was seeing them with new eyes. They were the features of a foreign country, a place I no longer belonged. When I walked into my house, David was on the couch, watching a football game. "Hey," he said, not looking up. "How was it? You look different." I touched my own cheek. "I'm fine," I said. "The ocean air did me good." It was the second lie. The first had been the kiss. This one was far more profound. It was the lie of pretending I was the same woman who had left 2 days ago. That night, I lay in my bed, in the quiet, familiar darkness, and felt the immensity of the choice before me. I could stay. I could fold this weekend away like a precious secret letter, tucking it into the back of a drawer to be taken out only in my loneliest moments. I could smooth over the cracks, ignore the tremor that had shaken my world, and continue to live the safe, comfortable life I had built. Or I could be brave. I thought of the mapmaker I had wanted to be. I had spent my life following the maps others had drawn for me. My parents, my husband, society. Now, for the first time, I had a blank page in front of me. The prospect was terrifying. It was a leap into an unknown wilderness without a guide, but for the first time, I felt the thrill of the uncharted. The true north is not a fixed point on a compass. It is the direction of one's own soul. I didn't know if my path led back to Julian and his house on the cliff or somewhere else entirely. I only knew it no longer led here. The greatest discovery of my life wasn't love in an unexpected place. It was the discovery that my own map was not yet finished. And with a steady hand, a heart full of terror and wonder, I was finally ready to draw it myself.